Hi there, welcome to this afternoon's video. I'm Phil Browning-Helsel, Austin Seminary professor, and I'm going to talk today about Duane Bidwell's book, When One Religion Isn't Enough. This was with Beacon Press. Chapter 1, Normal Spirituality. Chapter 2, Choosing. Chapter 3, Receiving. Chapter 4, Collaborating. Chapter 5, Field Guide to Spiritual Fluidity. And Chapter 6, Observations, Implications, and Provocations. This is an interesting book to me, a powerful book, and I found myself asking about if there's certain kinds of religious identity that tend to work especially well together, or could you be more than two, and to what extent is a religion an expression of a culture? And then I even found myself asking, is Christian identity a central part of being Christian? Or is there something kind of more profound even going on than Christian identity ultimately when it comes to religiousness? And I was very drawn to the fact that this book has such an emphasis on community. So that was one of my take-home surprises. So he talks in the introduction about a character from the life of Pi who refuses to be boxed into one religion, and he defines religious multiplicity as the experience of being shaped by, maintaining bonds to, more than one spiritual or religious community at the same time. That's on page 2. Spiritually fluid people, though, can evoke prejudice and curiosity. They can uncover assumptions and disrupt our typical labels, he says on page 2. We ask questions like, are they confused or idolatrous? Do they belong to our religious traditions? Trying to understand rather than evaluate multiple religious identities is Bidwell's approach, as both a Buddhist and a Christian. And he calls Jesus his savior and Buddha his teacher. Here's an important quote from his work. The two traditions remain distinct in my life, do not merge or create something new, but complement and inform one another, end quote, on page 6. He founds the tensions between Christianity and Buddhism feed him, and then diversity is more important to him than logical consistency, where you put the two together in some system. Instead, he says the framework for this is the call to abundant life and redeeming suffering. Here he might be speaking in part as his pastoral care or pastoral theologian self. He notes that most people keep their religious multiplicity to themselves for fear of being accused of being non-committal, and such people suffer from a singular religious identity. So singular religiousness for Bidwell is part of the problem, and it's a sign sometimes of religious privilege. So what he wants to do in this book is to entertain the experience of spiritually fluid people and what it's like, he says on page 9. He uses a mountain metaphor or a mystery metaphor, maybe more than one mystery. But then the pastoral payoff is how do people who are spiritually fluid resist oppression from singular religious identities, religious commitments, and contribute to the common good? And that's on page 11. So that was the introduction to the book. Here's the chapter 1, Normal Spirituality. Bidwell says he interviews Fidelita, someone who lived in Southern California and then Mexico City, who did 6 days a week of yoga practice, and on Sunday she's a Catholic. And asked the question, how can someone be a Hindu and a Catholic at the same time? Most people have one religion at a time. Most people even see religion as monolithic, propositional, and mutually exclusive, Bidwell says on page 13. But he calls this a kind of exceptional spirituality that doesn't fit expectations, but accepts multiple religious bonds. He says he's a Buddhist, but also a Buddhist Christian, but also a Christian Buddhist. One persona with two religious natures or principles of operation to play on a theme from Christian doctrine. That was on page 14. And he talks about religious pluralism in Mrs. Nguyen, a refugee from Vietnam, who had a shrine, when he was her chaplain, had a shrine to Jesus and Buddha in her home. And he talks about interfaith marriages where people are both, continue to be both. This goes back a while. The first Jewish Buddhist was in 1893. And Ippolito Desideria in 1716 argued that Buddhists could deny Christian God, but still be implicitly Christian because of an element of numinosity or mystery. So 13% of U.S. People in the U.S. say that Buddhism influences their spirituality, although only 1% say that they're Buddhist, which I found really interesting. Indeed, Bidwell wants to argue that most people are spiritually fluid to some degree, one extent or another, and that there's a weakness of an academic orthodox approach that focuses on just one religious identity, because it misses out on religious multiplicities as it's experienced in day-to-day life, and then it has an overly cognitive approach to doctrine and orthodoxy, and it can be a choice made by privileged whites. So the question really is, can spiritually fluid people reconcile conflicting beliefs, or do they care about the contradictions? He asks on page 23. He talks about some of his experiences in conversation with his denomination as a Presbyterian. When he was coming before his ordination exam board, he had a conversation with a Korean pastor who said, isn't it true that Jesus is the only way? And he was at this point of being excited about his engagement with Buddhism and was sharing some of his influences with Buddhism. And he talks about that experience as a kind of alienating experience of the religious multiplicity within himself. So the church in that instance, he argues the church was deciding if he could faithfully represent a tradition, which is an important part of the church's job, I guess. He talks about Ann Holmes Redding, who's an Episcopal priest who was defrocked for being 100% Christian and 100% Muslim. Page 26. In societies where spiritual monogamy is normal, religious traditions are multiple. And he talks about some of the mystics, such as Thomas Merton, who borrowed some notions from a medieval Muslim mystic without giving any credit. So sometimes people take from other traditions, and if there's kind of an enforced monogamy or singleness to a tradition, they might not even give credit for where that credit is due. And he mentions another historical example, Emperor Akbar, who continued to worship as a Muslim and a Hindu. He does acknowledge that sometimes religious borrowing can become appropriation. In colonialism, where natural resources and cultural booty are then extracted from a place, and when people who have significant cultural power or privilege take from marginalized communities, this is appropriation or colonialism at work. He talks about one person entering the healthcare system through the hospital and being asked for their religious identity and saying back, one part of me is Tibetan Buddhist and one part of me is Catholic. Which part is having surgery today, the nurse said, and he said both. And the nurse wrote down on the form, neither. So there really wasn't space for that religious multiplicity in that healthcare space. So religious multiplicity, Bidwell argues, is beneath the surface and widespread in America. A third of adults attend religious services outside their tradition, not because of an interfaith marriage. So this was really an interesting insight to me. That was on page 33. And Rose Drew says that belonging to more than one religion is desirable and that we should listen to religiously fluid people. Okay, so that was chapter 1 on normal and exceptional spirituality. Chapter 2 is about choosing. So this is really he's going to give us a kind of life cycle of religious multiplicity here, from its beginning to its deepening. Crisis can lead people to multiple religiosities, and religious multiplicity often starts with curiously spiritual nomads. So that's a familiar kind of posture in the new generation today. He mentions Reuben Habito, who was sent to Japan after Nostra Aetate in the Catholic Church said that God can work through a variety of religions, and who was sent to Japan to study Buddhism and incorporated the two traditions, Catholicism and Japanese Buddhism, into a mutually enhancing but not the same tradition. That was quote from page 40. So there's a strong multiplicity, identifying with two traditions as a source of truth. There's also spiritual but not religious, a pragmatism in kind of individuality and strategic multiplicity among those who are forced to convert. So sometimes people, it reminded me of the kind of classic work on conversion by Louis Rambo. Sometimes people are forced to convert, and there's a kind of hidden multiplicity then as they become the religion of the colonizer, but keep their traditions and maybe keep some of their religious frameworks if you look close enough. And he notes that missionaries also develop complex religious bonds, which was important to me as a third culture kid and child of a missionary, probably part of the reason why I was so drawn to his work. That was on page 45, he talks about that. He talks about Dom Henry Lassus, who moved to India and founded a Christian commune because he had a Christian experience. And he had a Hindu one, but they were not different, he says. They were not the same and not different. I'll say that again. So Dom Henry Lassus says that his Christian experience and his Hindu experience were not the same and not different. That's what he calls adviatic. So there's a refusal to stand with one of the choices that you might be forced to make, a kind of non-duality, even in some people's experience of more than one religious tradition. So people who are missionaries and scholars often have backing for their multiple religiosity, but spiritual but not religious people don't have that institutional backing. So he talks about Marie, who is drawn to Hinduism because of her own experience with death, but does not seek doctrinal clarity. And then he talks about Catherine Corneille, the Boston College scholar's discussion how all religion have the same reality beneath them. And Mark Heim, who says all religions have equally valid ends. So when people learn, but they have different salvation schemes that are separate. So you can see Bidwell's addressing some of the different ways in which people outline religious multiplicity and understand it theologically. But all of this is kind of to the side in a sense because he's more interested in the lived experience of beauty and creativity among people who have more than one religious bond, and not so much in how to figure it out intellectual. So it's not, his exploration is not just an intellectual one. In the Netherlands, 24% of people claim multiple religious truth claims. And he says that most people he talks to about their religious multiplicity don't seem confused about it. Instead, they're kind of negotiating a politics of truth claims, where there's maybe an aesthetic or exhibitive truth versus an active truth. So he wants to focus on what, this is on page 58, very important for his argument. Quote, focus on what religious truth known through beauty can disclose. So rather than a cognitive argument about what to believe about different religions, which tends to be pretty institutionally based, he's interested in on what we can focus on and what we can know about religious truth through beauty. He mentions Peter Pan being, that's P-H-A-N, being censured for being religious interreligiously in a recent book by the Vatican. And he says that most multi-religious people are used to being labeled as flaky. So he talks about Sita, who worshipped God and Jesus because of multiple religious bonds, did puja from family, and how 26% of Nepalis in Britain, in the United Kingdom, identify with more than one religious tradition. One woman he quotes, Without Islam, I may never have known God, and without Catholicism, I may never have grown to love him. End quote. That's the process of choosing. Chapter 3, the process of receiving. So he returns to the example of Sita, who was raised with both religions. When people receive multiple religious bonds, they have a kind of reverence that is multiple in its nature. And he talks about Korean people's reverence for heaven and being affiliated with multiple religious traditions. And how in Hawaii, multiple religions are ways of connecting with your neighbor. He gives the example of Yogi Chen from esoteric Buddhism, who created a ritual of fire in sacrifice to the 5 saints of Christianity, and an adaptation of the Stations of the Cross into a mandala. So the traditions toss out the idea of claiming an identity for oneself. So instead, the identity becomes a collection of meanings that are mediated and emerge between oneself and others. And he describes an example of chaplaincy when he switched between Buddhist language and Christian language based on the family's comfort. And because he was familiar with both languages, the family felt instantly like their desire for religion in their Buddhist sense was honored. So he switched from kind of a Christian identity when he came in the door to his Buddhist identity, and switched from the language of Christian faith and Christ and salvation to the notion of making merit. And then at the same time, he also has friends who've invited him to perform Christian rituals in healthcare settings. So he says he receives religious traditions like a many-sided gem. And so religious identity is not subjective or objective, but shared between people for the purpose of relieving suffering. We can be 100% both places. We can be no place with a constant border, or we can pass as mono-religious until we must move on to other identities, Bidwell says. But he also notices that people who inherit multiple religious traditions experience them more strongly. He gives the example of Sita again, who had a vision of her mother with Jesus. But ultimately, Bidwell says, neither social nor cognitive pathways alone explain why people are multiply religious. So we don't have to do anything reductionistic to kind of explain it down or fit it into a cognitive schema where it all fits together. Simply describing it through the lens of beauty is enough, through the apprehension of a kind of beauty of it. Chapter 4, collaborating. Carlos Alejandro, a board-certified chaplain after 9/11, felt the presence of Orishas, especially Oya, the guardian of the dead bodies in the morgue, and this drew him back to Puerto Rico and to his Puerto Rican heritage, where he became a priest in the Puerto Rican tradition, where they worship Orishas. And he wondered, if I practice in these traditions, am I betraying Christ? He went to Nigeria and became an Ifu priest, Sometimes complex religious bonds evolve as a response to God or the holy, Bidwell says. And people who have multiple religiosity sometimes wish that it were simpler, but they've experienced it throughout their life. He shares the experience of a Buddhist monk a Buddhist priest who also had a lot of influence from Catholicism, who was raised in Singapore in the 1970s, and whose religiosity as a kind of representative religious person was planned for him by his grandmother, who took him to shrines and mosques. So, and it also goes way back. His family ancestor on his mother's side was raped by a spirit, And that spirit created a lineage of divine ancestry on that side of his family. He also had intense Catholic experiences, mystical union at his first communion, and his paternal grandparents were Egyptian Jews. So you can see from this example that that form of religious multiplicity is really deep and complex and intergenerational in some ways. He mentions Rob Zollman's image of different religious traditions are being like organs in the same body. So in that sense, the spirit for Bidwell, quoting Ferrer, is an emergent creative potential of life, nature, or reality. And people who experience the truths of both doctrines or religious doctrines simultaneously, they have experiences of collaboration that are communions of knowing and being, where wisdom, cultural context, and the creative power of mystery flow together. That was one of my favorite parts of the book there at the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5, a field guide to spiritual fluidity. A field guide to religious multiplicity. So he says, it often begins with curiosity that feels transgressive or exotic, such as yogic breathing, something new, and that exploration can be filled with anxiety originally. And then it moves to past curiosity to engagement. During this season, safety is more of an issue. And then it's ripening after engagement. The multiplicity is no longer feared or liability, but people are less torn between religious communities at this point. And then it's giving back to the community, helping others who are religiously fluid. It isn't easy being religiously hyphenated, he says. It doesn't look straightforward. If salvation is your agenda, you're probably pushing one side of an equation. And complex religious bonds is more than just a hyphenated identity. Jhumpa Lahiri talks about how being hyphenated feels like you fall short on both ends of the hyphen. And one part of your identity cancels out another part multiple times a day, he says. So passing as singularly religious often involves a kind of code switching. There's also this notion that the two identities are separable, which he finds is often a fallacy. Being aware of that one's experience and also valuing the value judgments that people place on you, and then you're kind of faced with those value judgments subconsciously as you negotiate this complicated identity. So this can be linked to identity through race and ethnicity, and there's kind of a lot of judgments or stereotypes. He talks about context and how power flows through relationships and context. Affinity, people drawn to one community might speak to our social needs, while another community might speak to us emotionally or personally. Expression. There's a lot of questions around religious expression. So should a Christian Muslim cover their head during worship? Can a Buddhist Jew wear a prayer shawl while meditating? And then disposition. Different religions land at different registers. The Christian notion of salvation ultimately does not relate to most religions. So focusing back on salvation, Bidwell says, is really Christian-centric and marginalizes people from other religious traditions. But Bidwell wants to ask, what can people from religiously fluid traditions teach us about salvation? And it's something like participation. He draws from John Thatamano. Multiple religious participation is the conscious and sometimes even unconscious use of religious ideas, practices, symbols, meditations, prayer chants, and sensibilities drawn from the repertoire of more than one religious tradition. End quote on page 122. And so he has a really helpful chart. I don't have it laid out here for you, between attraction, behavior, and identity. So you start with attraction, and you might just flirt with something, and then there might be some dual practice between the two. And then there's behavior, where you have multiple full participation in different religious communities, and then multiple identities that both become part of one's identity. And finally, identity, multiple belongings, people who claim more than one religion and are claimed by both contexts. And then there's also religious hybridity, where people mix both religions to make something new. So the language that people use to describe religious multiplicity differs: crossing boundaries, changing lenses, learning new languages, following a map, running multiple programs on a single operating system. Some people describe how they're crossing into a new territory, but they don't even realize that maybe no two paths up the mountain are the same. So maybe the truth is that no two Christianities are the same, or no two Buddhisms are the same. And he's really interested in the language metaphor, so people who are religiously bilingual from birth, and how learning a second language actually might help you with your mother tongue. It might help you become aware of things in the first, and that we rely on different languages for different contexts. Okay, and then his final metaphor is oscillating, so sweeping back and forth between the two religious traditions, but becoming aware of where the religions overlap, and that's where you maintain a coherent perspective in those moments of overlap. Okay, here's the final chapter: observations, implications, and provocations. So Bidwell says a complex spirituality, multiple religious bonds are alive and well wherever people live, and it's going to continue to grow and subvert and expand notions of normal spirituality, especially with the rise of immigrants, more religions from cultures where spiritual fluidity is the norm. We treat religions as monolithic, existing in one form of thought or practice, whereas that's not the case in other cultures. And he focuses on practice and culture rather than dogma and purity. More visibility, he thinks, leads to greater acceptance. These bonds have to do with the complex ways we're shaped, and it makes the public communal nature of religion difficult to ignore. It takes heart in our minds after it is shaped by our relationships. So the cognitive is secondary to the relational for Bidwell. He mentions third culture kids. I found myself drawn to that as being more creative, flexible, and open-minded than the general population, less anxious in the presence of social differences. Since that's my experience, I was interested in that. Greater personal diversity, he says, is linked to greater prosperity and economic progress. Religious multiplicity, Bidwell argues, causes people to act differently. The stories of religious multiple people are coherent, credible, and differentiated. And they talk about multiple influences on growth, flexible, open to the world, engagement, and contained generative imagination. So Bidwell wants to destigmatize multiple religiosity, saying there's a ton of strengths that are available in it. In fact, religiously multiple people, Bidwell says, benefit mono-religious people by adding complexity and diversity to their lives through learning about multiple religious traditions. He asks several questions. Does it preserve the richness of each tradition? Does it adequately account for the messiness of life? Does it turn outward to promote freedom and responsibility? He thinks yes, ultimately, yes to all of those. And mono-religiosity, he thinks, won't lead to a single global religion, but will kind of flourish in colloquial practice. And he also says something deeply theological. He says our religious traditions are not God, and we don't have to defend mystery ultimately. And he also suggests that people need more care than one simple religious tradition is able to give. So I found Bidwell's book to be really riveting and intellectually a deep and challenging book. I also sensed that Bidwell was in his element, writing about something that mattered deeply to him. I found myself really drawn to further talk about what particular forms of religiosity work especially well together, and what those tension points might be. And indeed, what it's possible to know from another religion without entering it quite deeply. One of the things I was concerned about when I approached the book was that it might be just individualistic, but I didn't find that to be the case. I thought Bidwell underscored the need for community at each point in this book, and I found his approach to be refreshing and delightful. As someone who grew up overseas as a missionary kid in Southeast Asia and who's been influenced by Buddhist culture as a result, I found Bidwell's challenge in the book to accept some of my own religious multiplicity and my complex religious bonds incredibly powerful. And I think if Bidwell could just continue to do this work and show us the consequences for the religious lives of maybe even more marginalized people than himself for having multiple religious bonds, I think that would be a really helpful gift. Again, the emphasis on what religious multiplicity adds to us, the emphasis on beauty as a form of knowing, and the emphasis on relieving suffering all seem to work really well from a pastoral care standpoint. So I found myself questioning and critical when I first approached the book, but really compelled by it, and found the argumentation to be really nuanced and the picture that Bidwell paints to be a compelling one. So I hope that you enjoy this book as much as I did. Duane Bidwell's book, When One Religion Isn't Enough, by Beacon Press.